Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel and a little video update today in my ongoing series where I talk a bit about my project of writing a fantasy game book. Now usually I make these videos when I've done some work on my book and it has given me some thoughts and ideas I want to share, and also I want to talk about the process and the reasoning behind my choices as well. So last time, or really the last two episodes, I talked about how I was considering removing the visible ability scores and therefore also the visible ability score tests in the book, because I felt that, first of all, it gets a little bit convoluted, because when you have an ability test, you have a difficulty level of whatever you're doing. You may have things that give you bonuses or penalties to it, and also you need quite a bit of space before the book even starts to explain how it works. And because of those levels of complication, it's also easier to mess up a little bit. So for me as well as a writer, so I decided that I will keep track of the abilities of the player and the character in the background. The only visible game mechanics, apart from choices, of course, will primarily be there will be a little bit of inventory, so things you pick up that will be significant, and also sometimes when you do something or something happens that will affect future events potentially, I have a system of code words or codes, really, three-letter codes that I use as a sort of a flag to tell me whether something has happened or not. So the only visible part of the game mechanics of attempting to do something would then be, maybe there might be a question whether you still have an item or not, whether you have an item or not, or there might be a question of do you have code word this or that, and then that will lead you on different branching paths, where the actual test that you need to do to perform a certain task will be different, so that each paragraph will not have too many ifs and different alternatives to make it more tidy and less confusing. So for instance, in the beginning, there is a chance you lose your knife, and of course that will affect a lot of the things you do. Like if you want to make something out of birch bark, that'll affect that. If you want to create a fire, it will affect that. Everything is easier with a knife, and so having a knife or not having a knife will lead you on these branches that when you come to the point where you need to roll the die, the numbers you're given that will lead you to success or failure will be different. But of course, there will only be one set of those numbers in a single paragraph. So keeping it tidy and hiding the game mechanics, and also getting more of the flow of the narrative without the disruption that will ensue if suddenly you have to do mathematics. So suddenly you have to, if you had to do a skill test, you have to find your ability score, you got a target number, you have to roll the die, you have to add and subtract. It's very different to just being told, roll a die. If you roll 1 to 2, go to this paragraph. If you roll 3 to 6, go to that paragraph. That's what I'm doing, and I'm rewriting the beginning. And I did notice that in some cases I've actually mixed up the good result with the bad result, and this is so easy to happen. It's something that you find also in fighting fantasy books, because it is hard to spot. So in Starship Traveler, for instance, there are several places where the result paragraphs have been mixed up, and the good result is actually swapped with a bad result in the paragraph references for the die roll that you're making. What other things do I want to talk about today? So that's the main thing I've been doing. Now the thing is, once you start rewriting, you also sometimes have to add paragraphs to fit things in a different way. And I realized that I sort of started adding more paragraphs because there was some options I realized I hadn't included the first time around. And so now there's a whole other branch of narrative that I put in, even though it is actually a sort of a dead end, it can circle back to let you continue, but it's also potentially something that can lead you to an end. And then I realized that there's a very interesting potential for an end as well. Now, if you recall, one of the main concepts of the book is that you are taking part in a rite of passage, a religious imperative, as I sometimes call it, that you are required of you to spend a year outside alone in the sacred lands, and in order to discover things there, and to sort of experience the truth of what has been told before by the first person who did that. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that now. There will be, I might say more about that later. But of course, you are, in this book, the character is a teenager who's then suddenly been thrown out of house and home to spend a year alone. And that can be quite a traumatic experience. It's something that is very hard to prepare for mentally, as well as in other ways. And just the thought of it, even if you might seem easy even before you do it, but then of course you reach these obstacles. Things are hard to do. You might lose your knife, which is very disheartening, of course, because that is your most important tool. And there will be a time, and especially early on, where you will want to give up. And something I was trying to actually think about when I was doing my initial world building for this culture was how do they treat people who fail at the task, at this religious imperative. And I was thinking that initially okay, maybe they will be okay, but I mean, failing. Well, technically, there's two ways of failing. Obviously, there's one is never returning because you die, for instance, and the second is returning early, which means you've aborted your God-given task of doing the rite of passage. And of course, dying, that's fine, because that's inevitable. Some will die, and of course, it's part of the rite of passage and the ritual of it, that it starts with a kind of ritual death. So it's almost as if the person taking part in this rite of passage, they die, but they have to come back to life. That sort of thing. So the mental space, I suppose, of the people left behind is that this person is dead, and then they come back to life after a year. But not too soon. They can't come back until after a year. It has to be a year. For some reason, that is important to them. It's part of their mythology and the legends and the traditions. And so, and part of, very importantly as well, is part of that agreement you have, the covenant between the people and the gods. And of course, this is something that is so pivotal to understanding any religion, is what is that contract between gods and men. I mean, that is really what it comes down to. So that contract. And if you abort your rite of passage before the year is over, you are breaking the contract. So how do you deal with someone who breaks the contract between gods and men? Of course, most religions would give you the kind of answer that, of course, they have to be punished in some way. Because what you are doing, in essence, if you break the contract, is you are resisting the destiny that is, well, decided for you somewhere else by someone else, in a way. You are standing up to the gods. You are thinking yourself in charge of your own destiny. And that is, in many ways, the greatest sin. So you have to be punished. Initially, when I was doing my world building, I didn't think of it quite like that right away, and so I was thinking maybe they can come back and they will be part of the community, but they will not be able to gain high status. They will not be able to start families. They might be the ones doing the menial jobs, etc., etc., that kind of thing. And of course, that seems fair and not too cruel, but there is, of course, another alternative, and that is that having these people in the community after they have broken the contract with the gods is something that can be seen as a danger to society. Something that will lead the gods to be displeased with the whole community. And so, maybe the most natural solution, even though it seems cruel, is to exile them, to make them outcasts, to decree that they will never be able to return again to the community or to the Holy Lands or Sacred Lands or whatever it is, and to never again be part of that community or to be in favor of the gods. So, if you then in the beginning, there is a chance that you can actually go back to your village before the time has come that you should be, especially if you lose your knife. This might be an option. And of course, then the thing that happens is really it leads to an end of the book, but in a way, it also is a kind of a start of a new story, just a different one, not one that is being told in this book. And so I thought it was quite an interesting ending, and I realized that very often when you have endings in game books that are not the ending that is a victory, it doesn't have to be just death. Those shouldn't be the only options. One could say that, okay, maybe it's interesting to have multiple good endings, and when you get to one of them, that's fine, but you may want to play again and get another one. To me, that's not always that satisfying. I like having sort of one end that is the proper end, the one so you know that this is the one you're aiming for. This is the solution to the puzzle. But then you sometimes have these alternate endings that are bad in that you don't survive necessarily, or you certainly don't survive in the sense that you're able to finish your quest. But something else interesting might happen that could be a sort of a story in itself. And one of them is in Fighting Fantasy, of course, in Forest of Doom. There is one where if you acquire a certain crown and you put it on your head, you become a fire demon, I think, something like that, and you are a sort of a demon king. It's almost like it's a kind of a curse, but of course that is an ending that in itself can lead to a different story, and because you're not dead. So I was thinking, if you choose the path that eventually leads you, or you get directed onto the path that leads you to not completing your rite of passage, there is what I would call a colorful open ending where the book ends, but I was thinking that maybe that is so interesting as a starting point that I may do a sort of a spin-off sequel one day of where your character is someone who has done that, someone who has failed in the rite of passage. They have been scared and wanted to go back home. They've gone back home and they have become outcasts. And that would be a starting point, perhaps, for a whole new story that I may yet write. Of course, I will go focus on this first, but it's nice to have that as an idea because that also allows me to consider the option of what would happen if, for instance, someone who is outcast. Because what happened when you get outcast? Well, I'm just going to go through that as well. Because first of all, you have thought that whatever tasks were ahead of you were too difficult for you, or too challenging, or too scary. But by going back, you now are faced with a reality that might be even more challenging and scary as an outcast. A true story. So you might have chosen, that's your consequence of your choice. How will that make you feel? Will you be traumatized by that, by the whole experience? Probably. And how do you deal with that trauma? There are different ways, of course, to deal with trauma, and one of them could be revenge, for instance. So it is fathomable to imagine that someone who has been outcast may want to have some kind of revenge on the community, on the gods. They might want to desecrate the sacred lands and the temples there. There are many possibilities, and this is something that can tie in again. I mean, just those possible strings of narrative that can be woven from someone having become an outcast can be woven back into the current story, because you are in the sacred lands. Is it possible you might meet someone who is an outcast who's gone back there to exact their revenge on the gods? It's possible. Is it possible you may have seen some sign of desecration of some of the temples? How will this affect the story? There's some possibilities there too. And also, will it affect the village you come back to in some way? Will something have happened that can be caused or partly caused by somebody being outcast deciding to do something nasty against your people? Everything's possible. So those are just some of the ideas that I've been churning around, of course, and some of those ideas actually existed before, but not with the starting point of the idea of outcasts. So, of course, there are other. Of course, you could say that okay, there could be other story arcs to be made around others being in the sacred lands that shouldn't be there. There may be other storylines that could be lead to something happening to your village, but of course, now that I have the concept of the outcast, then of course it might be easier to actually spin these things together and into a coherent whole as well. So there are different things that sort of just happen when you start writing, or certainly when I start writing, where you get new ideas. Creativity begets creativity and all that. So that's what I've been working on, and that's some of the ideas that came to me yesterday when I was working, and yeah, and I think I will keep writing a bit more today and see how it goes. I might come up with something entirely different, but the main thing I'm doing right now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, I'm removing ability tests and replacing them, all of them, with just a single die roll or choices. Sometimes I will not do an ability test where there used to be one if there are reasons why I want it to be successful, or there are other things you have done that will lead to such a high chance of success that I will just let it happen. Oh, yes, there's one more thing as well. I wanted to talk about, and that is divine intervention. Now, an important aspect of many fantasy worlds is, of course, that divinities, the gods, are real, not like in our world, of course, where they're just created by people. So if you have a world where gods are real, it may be that your ideas of what the gods are about might be wrong. It may be that your idea of what the contract is between gods and men might be wrong. But if there are gods, they will have, well, either they will have an agenda or they will have their own ways of interacting with people that will be can be relevant to a story. And of course, I have some ideas about some of the main motivations of some of the main gods, for instance, being the balance. Some of them might have the motivation of preserving the balance of nature, for instance. And if this is something that goes into your culture as well as part of how some things are done, then how you act can affect how the gods feel about you. And you may be in their favor, or they may be displeased with you based on things you do, whether it goes with or against their agenda. So, and this can lead to divine intervention. Now, so an example of this is that, say that something bad could have happened to you. Something bad. There's a chance that something really bad could happen. But in the past, in the book, as part of your choices, you have done something that pleases the gods, or one god. And then, when this bad thing could have happened, the book will, of course, well, I, as the writer of the book, will know, because I can use code words, to know whether you have done a good or a bad thing against a certain god, and of course that will affect the outcome. You may not know right away as the player that is what has happened. You may not know why you are still alive. You may not know why you died, but it may actually come back to a consequence of the choice you made and how that is seen by some deity, and they're having that ability to intervene and help you or not help you, as the case might be, depending on your choices. There will be a few cases of that in the beginning of the book, and I'm thinking that at some point later in the book, those divine interventions may be actually more explicit and talked about, or mentioned, and you will understand what happened in the beginning perhaps was divine intervention. I haven't got quite to the point where I know how that will be handled yet, but you are in sacred lands. There are temples there. There are ways to commune with the gods through different means. There will be, and I don't know to what extent that will be something that's included in my book yet, because I haven't done any of those sections, but it is possible that maybe later you will be able to communicate with a divinity that has helped you in the past, for instance, and that aid that they gave you will be something that is acknowledged or mentioned, perhaps even something that is put some demands on you as well, as sort of a that they might feel that you owe them something as well for having helped them. I don't know yet. Just a thought. Right, I think that's quite long enough of me jabbering on about this. So I hope you found this interesting, and I will see you in my next video. So thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.